Hello and welcome to Fearless DIY Music. My name is Tristan Lass, and today I'd like to talk about amp maintenance. Those of us who do still use in the world amplifiers, sometimes we need to go through our amps and do some just basic routine maintenance to make sure that everything is working the way that it should be. If you are working purely in the digital realm, this video is not for you, but if you still use physical objects that plug into a wall outlet, you may be interested in watching this. I'm going to primarily be covering solid state amps, but also mention a few things about tube amps. A lot of this stuff applies to both. Let's go over safety first. I think that's the most important thing. Before you start pulling apart your amplifier, if it is a solid state amp, you don't have too much to worry about. If you unplug it and just kind of let it be for 24 hours is a very, very safe window, but you don't necessarily, at least I don't necessarily go through and take the time to discharge all of the power capacitors. I've never run into something where I've had to mess with the power capacitors when I'm actually doing routine maintenance or a minor repair. And it's certainly not something that I've come across as often as I have with, like, say, tube amps. It is very, very important that you discharge the power caps so that they do not kill you. The most basic way to do that is you can create a tool using a couple pieces of wire, and you can use a resistor in there. The resistor values depend upon how large the cap values are that you're dealing with. I will have a basic diagram up for you on how to make a discharge tool, and essentially you connect one end of the wire with the resistor in line to the other end of the wire, and then you can discharge your caps. Also, if you have want an in-depth exploration of how to discharge power caps in a tube amp, you should just Google it. Google discharging power capacitors in a guitar tube amp or bass tube amp or whatever tube amplifier, and there are so many DIY tools and there are so many step-by-step instructions on how to go about doing that. Let's pretend that everyone here has discharged their caps. They're either working on their solid state amp or their tube amp. What are we looking at when we start to take it apart? Taking apart an amp is usually pretty simple. From most of my experience, there are usually 4 screws on the top of your amplifier chassis, or the box that it lives in, not the chassis. The chassis is where the electronics live. But the cabinet that the amplifier is housed in, or the head cabinet that the amp head is housed in, will usually have 4 screws on the top. You take those screws out, and usually you can just slide the chassis out. The chassis is the metal part that houses all of the electronics inside of it. So once you have made sure that there's no live power left in the amp and you've pulled your chassis, you start poking around, you look around, and here are some of the things that I look for first. When I buy a used amp or even a new amp, I like to know what's going on under the hood. So almost all, amps made in the past 30 years, 40 years, I'd say 30 years, let's be safe, 30 years, have a 3-prong plug-in. So they are fully grounded. They have, a white wire, a black wire, and a green wire. Older amps often do not have that green wire, which is a ground. If you purchase an older amplifier that does not have a 3-prong electric cable that you plug into the wall, you need to go ahead and upgrade it. If it just has a 2-prong, you can very easily disconnect that 2-prong cable from the amp and just go to any, basically, like you could go to a hardware store, or you could go to an electronics store. You could use an old computer cable, but plug-in, but any 3-prong cable that you can come across, power supply cable, and then you just take the green wire, ground it to the chassis, the metal part of the amp that houses all the electronics, and then just put your white and your black where the white and black were, and you should be good to go. I've made a lot of money over the years basically putting 3 prongs on 2-prong amps. People are kind of scared to do it. It is actually quite simple. You can do it yourself, no problem. The next thing that I check, since you're in there and you're looking at the power supply, I check and trace all the ground wires and make sure that all of them are properly, connected, that everything looks like it is where it should be, and that there's no, loose connections or bad solders, whatever. So I just trace the basic solder trail and wire trail of my grounds to make sure that they are all as they should be. Because if your amp is buzzing and making lots of noise, I can almost guarantee you that one of the first things to check, and one of the first things that it could be, is the fact that there is a bad ground. All right. As you go through your amp, you also just want to examine the capacitors and the resistors that are on the circuit board. Look at everything. See if anything looks burned. See if anything looks like it's loose or there's no solder holding it in. Also, look for leaky things. On really old amps, you can find capacitors and things like that that are oil-based. Sometimes you find sludge inside of an amplifier. Look and see what component is creating that sludge, and then replace the component, because it's probably no good anymore. And that's another thing too. On older amps, you may want to check some of the most basic parts just to make sure that they're still in spec, because over time those tolerances can degrade and you may need to replace some caps and resistors and other components within the amplifier. Aside from grounding issues, another one of the big issues that you're going to find with noise in an amp is going to be from the potentiometers and from the jacks. For potentiometers, you have to take the amp apart to get in there to see the backs of the potentiometers. And the potentiometers are basically what are behind your knobs. When you're turning your knobs on your amp, you're turning a potentiometer. If they crackle, if they don't work at all, if they're intermittent, you get some deoxit, go in there. Don't use WD-40. Don't use any other solvent as far as I'm concerned. Use anything, though, you can use anything, though, that is rated safe for electronics and plastics. But deoxit is what I use. I go in with deoxit and I clean all the pots. There's usually a small opening somewhere in the back of the pot where you can spray in your cleaning solution and then work the pot back and forth until your scratching and intermittence all goes away, which it should. And if it doesn't, then the potentiometer needs to be replaced. And since you have the amp open, you can look at the value of the pot and order a new one. All right. Jacks, same thing. A lot of jacks now are sealed or like in a plastic casing. If you find that, and these jacks do tend to break, if one of those jacks breaks, I highly recommend just getting a Switchcraft mechanical jack to replace it with. Trace your wires. Usually there's just one or two, or not one or two. There's usually 2 or 3 wires going to a jack inside of an amplifier. So what you want to do is just trace those wires, make sure that you connect them properly to your mechanical replacement rather than using like a plastic encased jack. Unless you just want to take your product and leave it at spec. Then just order the exact same part. I always put mechanicals in, just old school jacks because they never go bad. All right. Another cool thing that you can do when you are taking apart your amplifier, if it's a combo amplifier and has a speaker built in, one of the best things you can do is do a speaker upgrade. If you're not happy with necessarily the sound of your amp, you can always just easily, taking 4 screws out, usually just 4, you can pop the speaker, disconnect the positive and negative leads, put a new speaker in. That is the right size and right ohm rating. Make sure that you're not putting a 16 ohm speaker into a 4 ohm rated amplifier. That will be bad news for you. Always try to match your speaker to your ohms that are coming out of your amp. Very critical. And don't get your negatives and positives confused. Positive wire's red, negative wire's usually black, and you just reattach them to the speaker. The speaker will have a plus and minus on it to tell you where to put your wires. I just recently did a speaker swap on the Acoustic Control Core 117, and I also recently did a full maintenance on it, going through this checklist. And here in a moment, we will take a little listen to the amp just because it sounds super good now, and I'm really happy with my choice of speaker. I got a Jensen Silverbird for it. I was going to put a greenback or a creamback in it, and decided to go with something different because I just wanted to see what it sounded like, and I've been super happy with that. Finally, let's say you've swapped your speaker, you've gone through your amp, you've maintained everything looks good, you've replaced all the faulty components, cleaned it. The last thing to check is just your cabinet itself, be it a head or a combo. Go through, if there are screws exposed, tighten all the screws, see if anything is broken or loose. Those can be things that can cause you a lot of trouble with your amplifier as well. Unwanted noise or rattling or vibration is usually just due to things being loose. So, like I said, I kind of was inspired just to make this video due to the fact that I recently went through my trusty acoustic control core 117 and just did some cleaning and stuff. So I'd like to thank everybody who's been supporting the channel. Please keep the likes and subscribes coming. I really appreciate it. Also shares and comments. It's I always say this, but it's just great to have a sense of community, and as it grows, I am really enjoying getting to know more and more people. But please, if you share, please ask the person that you share it with to go ahead and smash that subscribe button for me. I would really appreciate it. All right, so I'm just going to play out for the video, just noodle around a little bit. Like I said, I put the Jensen Silverbird speaker in, and let's just see how the old Epi sounds through it clean. And you guys take care, and we'll see you next time.